they're sort of going to these social media things. And it's the equivalent of like very quick in passing political discussion. Right. And so like, what's the quality of the news that the people are getting? Or like, what's the quality, stated differently, of the information on which their new or continued beliefs are based on?
That was Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant, political scientist at Queen's University, and my guest this week on What on Earth is Going On. My name is Ben Charland. Welcome to the show. Now, before we get to that, I want to ask you the favor that I always do. If you like the program, please give it a rating on iTunes or on Facebook or whatever podcast app that you use. And go to the website, wogopodcast.com. That's WOEGO podcast.com to listen to all previous episodes, to get links to go on social media so you can spread the word that way, or to get in touch with me for your suggestions for future episodes, future guests, and just to give me your feedback on this program. Now, my conversation with Elizabeth is a really interesting one about U.S. politics, about polarization, about the media ecosystem, and about the pink wave alongside the blue wave in the midterms of 2018, something that is now presenting real challenges to the President of the United States. It's a very interesting time in U.S. politics we're all aware of. Almost everybody in the world is following it as the reality TV show that it has become, and perhaps that it was intended to become. Elizabeth has a lot of insight, not just on the media angle of it, but on the polarization angle and how things not only have changed over the last few decades, but maybe have returned to a certain normal. It's a difficult conversation too, because we're dealing with real problems and real threats to our ways of life. And for a political scientist to be despairing or hopeful, I think, is an important question. Anyways, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. In any case, send me an email. Let me know what you think of the conversation this week. Enjoy. Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk to you. There's a lot of questions that I have for you about political polarization, about the comparison of politics between Canada and the United States, but then specifically talking about the examples of politics in the United States that are going on right now, especially after the midterm elections in November of 2018, which were a very important moment in U.S. history, not just because of the Trump presidency, but also because they weren't just a blue wave. They were, as you've called it before, a pink wave. Mm-hmm. There was a really increased role for women in politics. And I just want to reference a book that you wrote called Gendered News, which is about how news plays a role in politics and can kind of act as a gatekeeper, especially for women or people of different ethnic minorities for entering into politics. And in your first paragraph in the book, you actually talk about how maybe, the book was written in 2013, I believe, is that right?
Yep. That
maybe women have reached a sort of glass ceiling already at the 25% level. Of candidate, or not candidates, but of actual representatives in Congress or in Parliament in Canada and Western countries around the world. And perhaps the 2018 midterms in the United States have changed that, or have at least broken partly through that glass ceiling as a result of the Democrat blue wave. And really, there's no movement on the other side of the aisle. There's almost no new women candidates entering. Anyways, so I'd really, really like to talk about all of that stuff. But before we get to it, I've got the first question, which is always the same. Elizabeth, what on earth is going on?
That's a good question, actually, and I'm gonna take it real literal to start with, because I want to just mention this.
Yeah.
Today, what's going on is all of those new members of Congress are being sworn in.
Right.
Today is the first day of the 116th Congress of the United States. And I spent the morning looking at tweets and Instagrams and all sorts of stuff of this remarkable, especially freshman class of women, 35 of them, which is record-breaking. The last time there was quite a sizable jump, especially in newcomer women to Congress, was in the Year of the Woman in 1992. Mm-hmm. And women were, I think, 24 members of the freshman class. So one of the things that's going on literally today is this new group of fresh, more diverse, in some ways quite provocative voices are entering the House of Representatives, ready to speak out, stand up, and take on the establishment, including the establishment Democrats. and maybe, I don't know, maybe make something happen.
So why is that happening? I mean, there's one connection that I'll make, because you referred to 1992, the Anita Hill hearings with the confirmation of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. And of course, in 2018, we have Christine Blasey Ford testifying before Congress, or before the Senate, with the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh, both of which actually occurred, and both of which are seen to have led to an incredible rise in the participation of women, both as candidates and voters. But that's kind of a proximate cause that we could draw, but there are larger causes as well. So why is this happening?
So actually the parallel between those two historic examples is interesting and I think appropriate. Although keep in mind that the primaries for the races that, in which all these women won were held mostly long before Brett Kavanaugh's name even came onto the national scene. But then it did become a flashpoint that I think mobilized voters and I don't know, showed voters, especially college-educated white women, as well as African-American voters and all the other members of the Democrat base who supported Hillary Clinton in the last presidential campaign, that, this president and the current Republican leadership is not only not with them, but is prepared to do things, in some cases, that will deeply affect women's rights and racialized minority people's rights and so on. So I think for voters, it definitely mobilized voters. And we see this, I think, in part in the turnout. Turnout in this midterm election was historically high. Turnout is estimated to be at about 50% of the eligible voters. So, you would say eligible voters. And usually turnout in midterms is about 39% of eligible voters. So what we see is turnout levels that are more on par with presidential elections, than midterm elections. And a lot of those people in surveys, by like the Pew Center and other places, run these surveys to find out how people are thinking politically during these major electoral events. A lot of the people were motivated to turn out in order to send a message to Trump.
And Brett Kavanaugh aside, I mean, how much is this about Trump? And it's an important question because, the Me Too movement is obviously playing a big role in all of this. And perhaps why so many women were nominated in the primary season was a little bit because of the Me Too movement. And Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford is almost like not just a flashpoint, but almost an apex of this cultural phenomenon that we're seeing.
Yeah, and like a manifestation of it, right?
Right.
That definitely probably pushed more, especially women voters, to the polls. But wasn't the cause of this huge wave, right? I mean, so we see the earliest manifestation of this, like right after Trump's elected president in the Women's March in January 2017, right? Where, all the women in the pink pussy hats marched on Washington, like historic numbers of women, because they saw the danger that was coming. I mean, not just in terms of like Supreme Court nominations, but because of that, things like women's reproductive rights and all of this other stuff. Like this past December, not only has the president shut down the government, Congress has let the a key act on violence against women lapse. Right. So women's rights are definitely in danger right now.
When the Me Too movement first broke, I guess it was the fall of 2017.
Yeah.
There were some people who were writing that this was really the result of not only Donald Trump's election, a man who was elected about a month after he said, or had been revealed to have said, grab them by the pussy, because you can do that when you're rich and powerful. And then the Women's March when he was elected, but then he continued to be obstinate, unapologetic, and frankly, completely discompassionate towards women in his time in office. And, millions and millions of women, not just in the United States, but around the world, frustrated and unable to change the circumstance of the most powerful person in their country, maybe even in the world, who is disparaging of them. And so the energy turned into the Me Too movement, which was, well, we're going to we're going to affect change where we can. We can't take out this guy, but we'll take out everybody else, and maybe he will be a domino much further down. Do you think that that's an appropriate assessment, or is it a bit of a just maybe a misreading of many, many different factors at play?
No, I think that's that has a lot of insight in it, right? I mean, the audacity of right. So, I mean, Donald Trump didn't invent sexual harassment or misogyny or patriarchy or any of it, but the idea that somebody that represents those kind of values and that kind of behavior could become the most prestigious and powerful politician in the country, and in fact, some might say the world, was outrageous. And the fact that he did it by beating, I'm doing scary quotes right now, beating a woman, one of the most highly qualified nominees in the history of presidential elections, made it all the more so. So I feel like, you know, there's a long history of women seeing men in powerful positions behave badly towards them and other women. But I think this was really like, kind of like a last straw, a hair that broke the camel's back. Like they just, and especially following on the heels of such a good and like moral president as Barack Obama, who, I mean, not only was he quite inspiring to many people, but he was squeaky clean, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean,
Scandal-free.
You never heard any scandal about him or Michelle Obama. I mean, the most scandalous thing that came out about his family during his presidency, I think, is those pictures that showed his teenage daughter smoking a cigarette or, I don't know, a joint or something at a music festival. And you never heard any bad, like nothing sketchy about the Obamas at all. And then you have, you know, this man and his group in office. And I think it just became a breaking point where a lot of women in power politically in the entertainment industry and all sorts of industries came together and were like, we are done.
Right. And of course, the Trump presidency has almost normalized scandal and made it really a strength instead of a weakness. Because, I mean, Trump's whole game has been, far long before he was a reality TV star, of course, a politician, was that no news is bad news. That if you can keep yourself at the front page of everything all the time, it doesn't matter. That in itself is a victory. And I think that, you know, I can't imagine that he wanted the video to come out or the recording to come out where he said, grab them by the pussy. However, in the end, it just put him back on the front page on the same day that Hillary Clinton, I believe, was exonerated. There was another story there were two other stories that same day in October of 2016, which were buried as a result of that tape.
Was it an email, like a Clinton
I think it was
email story?
I think it was a Clinton email story, yeah. And it was buried underneath. And also it was that morning that the United States intelligence services confirmed that Russia was trying to interfere with the election.
Right.
Which is a story that was completely buried by the weekend.
And which voters don't actually seem to care about anyway.
Right.
I mean, so we could actually link this into, you know, the polarization issue, right? Part of what's going on here is that polarization has become so strong, not just among like parties or political elites, but among voters, that they either, I mean, there's many mechanisms through which this can occur in terms of political psychology. They either selectively expose themselves to news, so they actually just don't watch media that would criticize Trump and his behavior or other politicians and their behavior. When they see it, they discount it, right? Especially given all the talk in the U.S. about bias in the media, like ideological bias on both sides of the spectrum, right? You know, like so-called liberal media outlets will discredit other media outlets because it's conservative, and then the same happens on the conservative side towards so-called liberal media, as though there isn't actually good journalism happening in lots of different types of papers or TV outlets or wherever. And so this becomes a cycle, right? It allows people to just continue with their pre-existing beliefs and affinities and discounting evidence that is presented towards them. And the president and his entourage, or whatever you'd call it, don't help matters either, right? Because he's spent 2 years discrediting the press, talking about witch hunts. Like anyone who critiques him, it's a witch hunt, right? He doesn't know anything about the requirement that he submit himself to political accountability from all different, right? Not just the legislative branch, but also the voters, the media, whatever, right? That doesn't exist in his world. And everything's a witch hunt. Everything is a personal attack. And so then his supporters can go, well, no, they're just out to get him.
Right. It's fascinating to me when I see a news story break. I don't like to, but I often go to Fox News, the website, to see what they're saying about it.
What's their take?
So, well, often they don't have one, which is fascinating. And I challenge anyone who's listening to this to do the same thing. So when I heard, for example, in December of 2018, that the Trump Foundation was being essentially disbanded by legal order. A court had said you're corrupt, that you are essentially the pawn of the President Trump, and this organization is just a gigantic scam. So you're going to shut down. So that was a major story in the New York Times, partly because the New York Times, I think, was one of the ones who had found out about a lot of this stuff. FoxNews.com, that whole day, nothing. I couldn't find a single article about this. And sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's a slant, like this is another hoax, or usually it's almost a meta story. So Democrats are trying to use bad news about the president to undermine his agenda. Now, I'm sure that someone on the other side of these issues would say, well, the liberal media is ignoring these following stories. So I guess my question is about the media ecosystem, which has profited off of the president. There's newspapers, which we all thought were going to die completely, are now thriving as a result of this presidency. And I think it was Michelle Wolf, who did the White House Correspondents' Dinner, was very clear about that. She said, you guys love the president because he's very good for your business. And for someone like you who has written a book about the media and the media ecosystem, I mean, how does this play into it? And how do we as citizens challenge a media structure that both profits from this, but also seems to increase this dangerous polarization?
Those are really good points, actually. I haven't spent much time thinking about that angle, that sort of like parasitic, sort of commercialization of Trump's poor behavior, regardless of the ideological spectrum on which your paper finds itself. Right. I mean, that is absolutely going on. I mean, everything we know about the political economy of news media tells us that this is what's going on, right? Well, it means that media, regardless of political stripe, all have a role to play in like undermining the information role of the press for citizens. But also undermining then the accountability function of media in terms of political actors, right? Because if the reporting becomes more focused on the story or the sensational or selling, rather than the watchdog function, I mean, those two can be combined, I suppose. But I mean, I think what you're getting at is that the media are sort of a bit too focused on the sort of like more salacious parts of Trump's life.
Well, if it bleeds, it leads, right? I mean, what choice does the media have? I guess, I mean, the media
love reporting things like speculation about the Russian P tape or like, pictures of Trump looking sort of fat or old or Right,
and we live now in a world where there's innumerable sources of information, and frankly, if one looks boring, I'll just go to something else. Whereas there was a time when there was 3 broadcasters in the United States and your local newspaper, and you were most likely getting your news from those sources unless you were paying extra to get a delivery of the New Yorker or the Economist in your mail, right? And your level of information was based on your willingness to engage with it. And now everybody is exposed by simply being on social media to this wide range of sources. But it's dangerous too. I mean, Trump, I think if I were to ask people what's the number one most dangerous thing Trump has said or done, a lot of people would say that he's called the press the enemy of the people. That's probably, and he continues to do it. And he's been goaded into doing it day after day after day. And I read an article the other day about, I think it was a journalist there was one in Malta, but there's another journalist in Eastern Europe that was just killed because they were researching and looking into corruption. And they're being killed with impunity. And I think part of that would be because most people throw up their hands and say, well, whatever, he's a journalist or she was looking into something and they're biased or whatever. And this discrediting of the media is extremely dangerous because if you're going to be killed by looking into a story, I think most people won't look into it. Most people are going to preserve their own life. So, while Trump is turning politics into a reality TV show, which seems like all fun and games and it's just a big show, there's a real dangerous element to it as well.
Yeah. Well, and we saw that too recently with, this altercation in the Q&A session or press conference with Trump, and then he expelled that journalist from the press pool.
Yeah, Jim Acosta.
Yeah, right. And there was this whole big thing about, and he was really bullied by the president. I mean, not only is that dangerous from a sort of the perspective of the role of media in a political system, it was also just remarkably strange, right, to see a president behave that way towards the press.
Yeah.
I mean, presidents mustn't really love dealing with the press because, right, they ask hard questions and, it's their job to tack you to the wall a bit, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I always had the sense that, there was also a sort of camaraderie or mutual respect, or we're all in politics in one way or another, especially in places like Washington, D.C. or Ottawa or London or big political areas where there's going to be a lot of political oriented journalists and it just surprised me the level of personalized animosity that existed too. That just seemed really unprofessional, strange. I mean, it's just another way in which Trump is a fish out of water in this world.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have the background training or really the personality traits that are really amenable to being in this world, right? Which is composure under fire,
right,
professionalism above all else, all these kind of values.
Right. And yet with every time he breaks a norm, so with every time he does something extraordinary or crazy, he also normalizes it too. And so back in November, you gave a lecture along with Peter Lowen from the University of Toronto in Kingston, and you talked a lot about the pink wave in the midterms, and Peter talked about polarization in politics, both somewhat referencing the what's happening in the United States. And he said two things that were really interesting that relate to what we're talking about. One was that that the institutions that we're looking at are anti-fragile, which means that they're strengthened by challenge. And so, my question would be, when it comes to the press, is that true? It seems like the more our institutions are attacked, the less that they are institutions in the first place. So let's just stick with that. Do you think how do you think our institutions are holding up? And do you think that they're stronger as a result of this disruption? Or do you think that it's true that the more that they are disrupted, the less they become institutions at all?
Yeah, those are interesting but hard questions. So I think the more, I would add a caveat to what Peter said and what you're saying now. The more institutions are challenged and manage to hold their ground, the stronger they are.
Right.
Right? So the challenges, for example, that the Constitution has seen from Trump in terms of what powers he has as an executive or whatever. So that ground has been held, and so great, And the extent to which the legislative branch is, especially now, going to stand up to Trump, the design of the Constitution is going to be sort of validated and strengthened. With the press, I think it could be a little bit different, right? Because it doesn't have any formal standing as a political institution. It doesn't have a place in the Constitution or... Do you know what I mean? So I think it would be relatively easy to actually permanently or at least long term undermine the role of the press in politics, especially given that there are other pressures that the press faces. Many of them economic, right? So, a lot of papers and other forms of media are really struggling financially. You mentioned how the Trump presidency has been a real gift to media in some ways.
I think to the big players of media, but local papers are still dying.
Right. So the big circulation papers, for example, are ooh, yay, and so the extent to which profitability is maintained, I feel like owners and managers are going to I mean, aren't they just going to say, well, okay, you know, the press has been challenged in some ways, but like we're still afloat, we're doing well financially, so we'll just go with it, right?
Well, to what extent are we maybe entering a new paradigm of what the press is and how we conceive of it in our society, especially with technological change, right? I mean, going back again to the idea that most people now receive their news in an online fragmented fashion, which operates as an echo chamber to their reality. So it reinforces biases as opposed to challenging them. And, you know, if I come to Facebook with a certain set of beliefs, Facebook or Twitter or whatever program is going to not only augment those beliefs and sell me things or show me things that I want to see, but it's probably going to increase the amount in which I believe those things, as opposed to, hey, how about this? How about here's an article that you won't like, but is good for you, like broccoli. I mean, what fast food when is McDonald's going to start serving broccoli? Never. It's not in their interest. Right. When is Facebook going to start showing me articles that will make me angry? That I will say, don't show me this again, right? And how much? To what extent is technology reshaping the institution of the media that we have taken maybe for granted for a long time?
Well, to me, there's like two sort of, I guess, major dangers actually in what you're describing, right? So it's not only echo chambers or like declining exposure to information from other sources, especially other ideological sources, right? But we're also talking in conjunction with that about a declining quality of the news that we're consuming, right? If a lot of us are consuming news in alternate formats, and some of that is second or third hand through Twitter or whatever, right? Like someone tweeting out something that they read in the paper and putting their own, like, do you know what I mean? Like a lot of people are not reading like primary text or like firsthand news anymore. They're sort of going to these social media things and it's the equivalent of like very quick in passing political discussion. Right. And so like, what's the quality of the news that the people are getting? Or like, what's the quality, stated differently, of the information on which their new or continued beliefs are based on? Right. It's very poor, or at least scant. Right. And this is in a time too when many major news outlets, not all, but many, are decreasing in any case the volume of really like long form investigative reporting that they're doing, right? Like news is becoming more brief anyway. And the kind of news that the average voter is getting is in an even more condensed form, like, you know, 280 characters or like a Facebook post or whatever they're looking at. So I think that's two reasons for major concern. So, the other issue that I would raise around that too is, you know, echo chambers, whether it's in social media or as a result of the fragmentation of news sources, right? This narrowcasting rather than like national broadcasting, where you can sort of choose which type of news, like, am I a Fox News person or like a New York Times person or whatever? The other issue too is that like, I feel like there's less of a national conversation going on about political issues or political events, right? Because as you said previously, some news outlets will just ignore certain stories, especially if it isn't good for their sort of political point of view, right? Like stories that are critical of Trump or whatever. And so the extent to which the entire political community or like large regionalized sections of it are talking about the same issues or the same challenges, I think it's declined a lot over time. And I think that can be bad for our politics, right? Because we're just sort of talking past each other or like focused on different issues. Right.
Well, and I think we're also talking about not only disruption, but distraction, right? And, you know, to go the Noam Chomsky route and his long-time analysis of politics in the Western world, in which essentially says that a lot of this is a distraction for what is really going on. And of course, Donald Trump would be a master of gaslighting and distraction to prevent you from seeing what's actually going on, whether he knows it or not. And I think there's a vertical and a horizontal dimension to this. There's the obvious one. If you're paying attention to the crazy thing Donald Trump said yesterday in a press conference or at a rally, you're missing the things that the the Congress is passing, that the Republican Party is doing, not only at the federal but the state and the local level. Massive changes to tax policy or to social policy that are going without any recognition. But there's another aspect to this too, which is that The New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian and the Economist have no problem hiring investigative journalists, which was something that we feared 2 or 3 years ago, that investigative journalism is going to die and all we're going to see is the surface of things. Well, they now can hire huge teams of investigators, but they're working on major national global stories. The local stuff, the state level or the provincial level stuff in Canada is being missed and going to be missed more and more as the current infrastructure of news is being hollowed out. And which is why in Canada, for example, the government is trying to put some money and put some backbone into the way we cover daily life at all levels of society. But this key word I think is still distraction. I mean, all of these things are hunting for our attention. But to what extent are they actually pulling us away from the things that are actually changing the structure of civic life from day to day?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is sort of a key question, right? Yeah. Distraction. I mean, I just agree with you. It's a problem. I don't have anything. Yes. I don't have anything better to add on top of that at all.
Well, okay. So I guess then to follow up on that, we're talking about distraction. What about polarization? So the other thing that Peter said that I wanted to take from and bring up in this conversation was that following the Second World War, there was a compression and a convergence in living standards around the world, but there was also a sense of bipartisanship in the United States, but across the Western world. There was a sense that both sides could get along, and that was seen as normal until the current state of affairs, which is maybe not just Trump, but a little bit before that, where polarization has become extreme. But what Peter said is actually polarization in American politics anyways is the normal state of affairs. And the anomaly is the post-war bipartisanship era. Do you agree with that? And do you think it's helpful to look at it that way? Or are there other factors at play that make the current state of affairs dangerous just in regards to polarization?
Yeah, I guess I would say a few things. The first thing I would start with, of course, is as you're saying and as Peter said, and as the data are very clear, baselines matter. Right. So polarization has increased since the, post-war era and after, like the building of the welfare state and this very golden time, and especially the history of Western countries. But historically, right, if your baseline starts like at the post-Civil War era, it's a return to a historic norm. Do I agree with that? Yeah. I mean, the data are clear, right? So that is what's happened. But that doesn't mean that it feels the same, or that qualitatively political life or the extent to which parties are willing to work together, or voters, how they view each other is the same or whatever, right? So it's polarization measured in a certain way, but there's still a lot of context and sort of nuance we could talk about, is this era particularly alarming or dangerous or whatever. One thing I would also say in terms of the post-war year, basically from post-war to the 70s, right? This was kind of a special time, right? In American and sort of world history, right? So it was a time of incredible economic prosperity. So one thing I would say is that it's easy for parties and voters to get along when harder choices about who gets what, or who gets what entitlements or infrastructure projects or whatever aren't made in the same way as they are now. So when the economy is performing like gangbusters, everybody wins, even if you win more than me. Coming off of the Second World War in almost a generation, I feel like people, this was a time when people were just ready to forget conflict and this is the time when this sort of idyllic American dream of a suburban house and 2 kids and a stay-at-home wife and a Leave It to Beaver, Brady Bunch life is sort of forged, right? So, I mean, there's all that going on that I think it was an easy time in some ways in American politics.
Right.
And you also had a couple of sort of visionary political leaders that were able to broker across political divisions, right?
Yeah.
So starting with people like FDR, but then JFK and this sort of thing. And
right. And it looks like a halcyon time of cooperation. And I think another key here is shared prosperity, right? I mean, sure, the Western countries have always been unequal to some extent, but in the post-war period, they were far less unequal than they are today. And there was at least a sense, qualitatively and quantitatively, that prosperity was shared and generally equal. I mean, some people were taxed at 90% in that period in Canada and the United States. And now there's a sense today of increasing inequality that is really pushing at the seams of our institutions and our way of governing ourselves. And I think it's a question that can really be asked of any conversation in which we ask what on earth is going on. I think there's a few key things that are happening in the world today. One of them is technology and the incredible disruption of not only social media, but in the future it's going to be artificial intelligence, in the internet at large, and in the increase of ability for large players, whether they're Google or Apple or Facebook, to essentially know you better than you know yourself. Amazon, of course, as well. But the other factor that's at play that can always be asked in a conversation is inequality. So, and social inequality, political inequality, but economic inequality, which might be underpinning all of this. How do you think that factors into this, whether it's polarization or the pink wave in the midterms? How does inequality play a role?
Well, that's a huge part of the story, I think. So inequality can look lots of different ways, right? And so you're sort of, motioning towards a type of inequality in which the lowest or among the lowest levels are still doing pretty good. Even if inequality is still high, because it was, right? But when the lower like the bottom, like third of income earners or quarter or whatever, start to do worse and worse and worse, which is what's happened now. And the people at the top zoom ahead in terms of the amount of affluence they control. I mean, that's what we get now. And that's why, in part, so there's this great book, this great sort of program of research by this scholar I really love in the United States, in Wisconsin, her name is Kathy Kramer. And she's sort of pioneered this whole idea of the politics of resentment. And is sort of using it as a lens through which to explain the rise of not just Trump, but like the rise of, some of the Republican politics we're seeing now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm going to simplify it in horrendous ways, but basically the idea is the reason why you see such huge, like in terms of widespread, but also unwavering support among non-college educated white voters, especially male non-college educated white voters, is because they don't see an economic future, many of them, especially men living in the heartland. So this would include Rust Belt states, parts of the Midwest, and so on. Right?
The former heart of industrialized America.
Exactly. So these are the victims of like industrial automation. So by the way, it's not the movement of jobs to Canada or Mexico, it's automation, which has killed like a lot of industry in the United States, as many of us know, right? So they're the victims of automation. They don't have the education and training to like pivot, right? And many of them are also older, right? And it's difficult so for lots of different reasons, these people are feeling left behind. And what people like Trump are offering, so Trump in the United States, but we see it in other countries too, right? Like Marine Le Pen in France, following right on Trump's election.
Maxime Bernier in Canada.
Maxime Bernier, totally, with the People's Party now, right? UKIP in Britain. Well, and that's like a key message in the Brexit vote, right?
Yeah.
So we see this manifestation of right-wing populism that targets these people who were once the like backbone of the middle class and who are now struggling. So that's a big part of, I think, I'm sort of going off a bit here. Pull it back in. But like, this is a big part of the inequality dynamic that's happening today.
Right.
So so let me be clear about what's happening here. Like in a sentence, it's people who were once prosperous, doing well, the backbone of the middle class, who are now behind. So it's people losing ground.
So to what extent is this real, and to what extent is this perceived? Because I know that a lot of work has been done to say that, like Steven Pinker, for example, will say that things are actually getting better from day to day. And yes, there are people that are suffering, and there are people who are big proponents of globalization. And I believe I've said this on the podcast before, who essentially say that when it comes to globalization and free trade and international business, yes, there are harms, but there are benefits as well. The benefits outweigh the harms. However, the problem is, and why you need political support, is that the harms are concentrated, whereas the benefits are diffuse.
Yeah. I mean, that's consistent with what I'm saying, right?
Exactly.
So like in the U.S., we see these regionalized pockets of economic decline, and the harms of that, or the negative consequences of that, are felt disproportionately, though not only by non-college educated white men, but also non-college educated white women. I mean, some of this too is, even if you aren't personally affected, right? Like if you're not personally affected, but you see your region declining or your city or whatever, like that can still have the same effect,
or
right?
just the story of it too. I mean, there's many people who say, look, the problems of your city or your town or your region, your state, your province, your country, whatever, your demographic position. If you're a college or a non-college educated white person living in Indiana, the problems that are facing you have nothing to do with black people, Mexican people, with women, with gay people in New York City. They're totally unrelated, right?
Yeah.
However, it's really easy to tell a story that says these people are not only taking your jobs, but they're changing your country. They're taking away your traditional values. And I think that what Trump did, both now as president, but also in his campaign, was capitalize upon this resentment, which is, I think, a really important word that you use. And Stephen Bannon, who is his campaign manager up until the day that he won, and now no longer works in the White House, he's on a speaking tour. He's working in Europe to build up populist parties there, and he believes that the future of politics is populist. And he opens up almost every speech that he gives by saying, what happened with Trump? We go back to 2008 and the Great Recession. And he argues that because of the massive bailout from the government under first Bush and then Obama, created a story whereby people think, well, all of these rich people are getting all of the help of government, and the rest of us are being left behind. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. And the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was a left-wing movement, and the Tea Party have sort of merged together in this resentment and have backed Trump. And then everyone else who's against Trump is almost the real conservatives of society, the ones who are saying, whoa, don't change anything. Everything's going to be fine in the future. Now, there's a lot to be said, obviously, or not to be said about Steve Bannon. But I think it's an important point that there's what's actually happening on the ground, but there's the story that's being told. And my question, I guess, to you is, I mean, to what extent is there a gap between those things, and how do we counter this narrative when it's so appealing to those who are sitting in a different room from you and I today?
Yeah, I mean, it's right. So there's a perception, and then there's the reality, right? Because the reality is that the economy is performing great, and unemployment has rarely been lower than it is right now. And but it's hard to. It's hard not just to believe that. I mean, that's the first step, right? It's hard enough to believe that, but then just like process that, or like have it be politically relevant to you when GM just closed the plant in your town, right? Which, GM closed 4 plants in the US and then 1 in Canada too. And we saw that kind of rhetoric coming out of that closure, out of Oshawa, and we're sure to see it in the 2019 Canadian federal election next year from Andrew Scheer and for sure Maxime Bernier and people like this, right? So, I mean, I guess, how do you close that gap? You don't. I mean, I guess that's the sort of bottom line. Like the other side, the Democrats or other political entities will maybe try to do so, but again, back to the polarization. If you already believe what one party's telling you,
right,
it's going to be difficult to change your mind, right?
Well, I mean, we're sitting here at a university, and we will often talk about evidence-based decision-making and basing things on the facts and the figures and the data, as opposed to supposition and emotion and not only speculation, but, sensationalism, right? so it's easy for us to say that and to talk about this story, but to someone who's not college educated, I mean, how do you like get through? How do you reach across without, for example, without turning to basic identity politics on the other side of the spectrum, which can be just as dangerous, really, when we're just dividing people into your group and saying, if you're not part of the groups that are aggrieved, then really just shut up, right? You really have no right to enter the conversation. There are people on campuses. I mean, it may be but it may be given more time than it's worth. But there are certainly people out there who you see it on YouTube videos all the time who say, "Hey, if you're a white male on campus, you really don't have a right to speak next to somebody who's an aggrieved member of society." And maybe it's because I'm a white male, but I think that's a very dangerous way to look at the world around us. But all I'm saying, I guess, is that there are dangerous narratives on both sides. And just simply to say, well, here's the evidence is a difficult proposition, especially in an era which seems to be anti-intellectual, suspicious of academia.
I mean, I don't know the answer, like how you formulate a message that will be salient to the group that is now resentful, right? It might help if all political actors would acknowledge the difficulty of their position, right? Like, so if we're talking about college-educated white men, for example, in the United States, I mean, it might be politically valuable for the Democrat Party to focus more on this demographic and to say, listen, you know what? You were socialized and lived your life in a certain type of era and you had certain expectations and now everything's changed, right? I mean, this is part of the reason why someone like Bernie Sanders was so popular among people like this, right? Like he did very well among, non-college educated white men compared to Hillary Clinton, who is like the like quintessential, right? Like left coast elite, right?
Institutional candidate, yeah.
Or left coast. Well, she's not from California, but anyway, like coastal elite.
Might as well be from California.
Like, like lawyer, feminist, like, totally.
But also part of the political institution for most of her adult life,
Right. So she's one of the elites, exactly. She was part of the swamp that Trump was supposed to drain. So someone like Bernie Sanders, who did actually spend a good deal of time speaking to especially white men in these kind of like sunset industries or like in these regions that were suffering economically, and developed this whole following of people, right, that they dubbed Bernie Bros, which is kind of a dumb moniker, but whatever. But he did well. And he was sort of using the language of the traditional left, right, rather than the left that gets more associated with like identity politics. Right. Which would maybe be a bit more Clinton-esque, whereas he was a bit more traditional, like, how do we help the working class and like redistribution and like this labor, kind of stuff. Labor. The labor left. Yeah. Right. Like the traditional like depression and wartime and 50s era left versus the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s era left that became more focused on like women's rights, gay rights, that sort of stuff, right? Yeah,
almost ceded all the other arguments to the middle ground under the Clinton years.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, so all of this conversation speaks to like maybe stuff the Democrats should keep in mind for choosing their candidate for 2020, right? So pick someone who can speak to the resentful.
So speaking of that, like to return to the beginning of the conversation where we talked about women in politics and the pink wave, when we look at U.S. politics, it's hard not to be despondent. But how do you feel about things, not just in your gut, but with the way things are going? I mean, are you hopeful? Do you think that there's some sunlight on the horizon? Do you think that the midterm elections are a sign of greater and bigger change to come? Or are we still in the middle of a very dangerous moment of history?
Goodness. I mean, I guess I'm so hopeful. Well, what does that mean in this context, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure this conversation would, it would surprise nobody who's listened to this podcast that I hope Trump isn't elected in 2020. So I'm hopeful that the Democrats may pull out a performance with the right candidate and actually regain control of the White House. Or at the parties never oust an incumbent president, right? So it's not like the Republicans could choose someone other than Trump, really.
Well, there is talk now of Mitt Romney after his op-ed.
So what I wanted to say is, like, I'm not so rabidly ideological or partisan that. So I would also say, or if it's not possible for the Democrats to win, maybe the Republicans could find a better candidate, right? Because, even when you think of recent history, the Republican candidates, leaving Trump out, have been decent, pretty good, right? Like, or at least there are things you can compliment about them, or political issues that they prioritize. You can say, yeah, I'm on board with that too. Mm-hmm. So Mitt Romney, John McCain, John Kerry. Well, people have even become nostalgic about George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Or did you see all the swell of emotion for George H.W. Bush when he passed, and like the really romanticization of his record. And I feel like that's a direct result of Trump and like the despondence that people feel. Anyone who is at all like a decent human being and like a sort of okay president, all of a sudden
is vaunted for their...
Yeah. So I'm hopeful the Democrats, couple things. They're going to think hard about what kind of candidate could beat Trump, right? Because I'm a huge Hillary Clinton fan, but there were some challenges there. I mean, she won the popular vote. She won.
By 2.9 million.
Totally. Yeah. But so I'm thinking now of the fact that Elizabeth Warren has basically like announced her run for the presidency, and I'm like, oh, this could not be great for the party. Even though I like Elizabeth Warren in some ways as a politician. Sure. I don't know that it would be great for the party, and I definitely don't think she's the best shot they have at beating Trump.
Well, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because, I remember when Michael Avenatti was saying that I should be the candidate for the Democrats, and his argument was essentially you need a Trump of the other side to beat Trump. You need someone who is not part of the elite, who's a fighter, who's a tough talker, who's a straight shooter, whatever, all of those things, like a man, right?
Like a sleazy scumbag.
Really, yeah, and but his argument, I think, was persuasive to some people who said, yeah, I mean, no matter who we elect from within the party, we're essentially playing into Trump's trap, because Trump, no matter what, remains in the eyes of many people, even if it's not true, the outsider to the game. The besieged outsider who has brought the people's voice into the White House. I mean, that might sound ridiculous to those who actually read into it, but that's the story that's being told persuasively to millions of people.
That guy should not be nominated president because he doesn't understand how presidential campaigns work, right? The people who are voting for Trump are not going to change their minds. Right. Polarization. Right. They're going to vote for Trump again, or they're going to stay home. The key to winning in 2020 is mobilization. Turnout, right? Like any political operative or campaigner or practitioner will tell you, mobilization is really the easier way. It's way easier than conversion. So the Democrats need to nominate somebody who will not only either appeal or at least not turn off their base. Yeah. Because the base will vote for you regardless, right? More or less. But mobilize fresh voters. Like these... House candidates did this time, right? Mm-hmm. I go back again to the sort of midterm turnout rate of 50%. It's huge. It's 11 percentage points higher than average. So they brought a bunch of new people into the midterm electorate that hadn't been there before. And that's the key to winning, I think. So maybe I'm overstating that, plus targeting the so-called purple states. Right.
People who are like the suburban voter who really just, what's the best
and
for
forget
me?
about Trump's forget about the states more or less that Trump won in the double digits in 2016, right? Mm-hmm. Don't waste your money, your time, or your breath.
Right.
And exactly, nominate a candidate who's going to be able to mobilize voters and pull in the purple states. I mean,
so you do sound hopeful after all.
I am hopeful. I mean, So studying elections for a long period of time too, there's no way you can't be hopeful, right? Because the pendulum swings.
Well, and I think, and
so at some point the Democrats will regain control of the House or the White House, and 8 years after that, the Republicans will take it back. So
right. Well, and I'm cognizant that I'm asking a political scientist about hope, and hope is not necessarily framed in partisanship, but rather, and my side winning, but rather in hope for the institutions and for.
Well, yeah.
Right, and
that's it.
And I'm cognizant of that, but we're getting close to the end, so I've got my last question for you. So, Elizabeth, if you could ask anybody what on earth is going on, given all that we've talked about, who would you ask and why?
God, I don't know. Who would I like? So,
if you could have this conversation,
if I could have this conversation, and they would answer honestly and candidly, what on earth is going on? I don't know. I'd probably, it's so lame, but I'd probably like sit down with like Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama and be like, let's get your like realness. Talk to us about what you saw. Right, because these are the people who either were or aspired to be in his shoes, right? Trump's shoes.
Right.
And they must watch every detail with, interest, concern, whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I don't have a better answer.
No, that's
than that.
great.
But like that would be good because they're both still so guarded, right? Just because they're professional, but they're also just like, quite politic as people, right?
And I think Obama's MO since leaving office, at least for the first year and a half or so, was I'm gonna close my mouth until he says or does something that is truly beyond the pale, because it's not my job anymore. Look, I gotta pass the mantle on to somebody else, and I think that is the old school but respectable way of doing things, which must be really hard for someone like him to.
Yeah, well, and there's sort of a norm too that immediately upon leaving office, well, and for a long time after, you're not a partisan commentator anymore,
you're a
right?
national
like
figure.
you're supposed to sort of be above that a bit now, especially in terms of partisan politics. Now Obama has spoken out about politics or like political issues or policy, but yeah, I mean you become like a Supreme Court justice. You don't talk about that anymore, really. Yeah.
I had a guest a few weeks ago, Rochelle Laforêt, in the public policy program here, and she her answer was Justin Trudeau, but not because he's Justin Trudeau, but because he's the Prime Minister. What would the Prime Minister answer to that question, given being at the center of all of these different forces that are at play, right?
Oh God, he hates Trump. For sure he does. It's such a problem in his work life that he has to deal with this person, right? Like, it's like your closest counterpart, is unpredictable, irrational,
personally offensive,
hypersensitive, and you're like, oh my God, I can't work in these conditions.
Right. It's unreasonable. Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I've had a great time and I've learned a lot. So
me too. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
That's the conversation this week. To learn more about Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant, please visit the website, wogopodcast.com. That's WOEGO podcast.com. And at that site, you can listen to all previous episodes and get in touch with me about your suggestions for future episodes and to let me know what you think about the show. Your quote of the week is from the editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick. It goes, Donald Trump provokes no moral disappointment because he creates no moral expectations. Close quote. Now, I bring this up not just because it's about Donald Trump and U.S. politics, but this question of morality, something that we do not address enough in our discourse and in our politics today. Anyways, next week we've got an expert on organized crime. His name is Antonio Nicazo. He's a professor at Queen's University, and we're going to ask him what on earth is going on with the mafia. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you next week.